Hello, everyone. I'm Ivo Daalder, president of Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and this is World Review, our weekly look at news from around the world. A lot of news this week, but we're going to concentrate on what is happening in China, where Xi Jinping is consolidating power and throwing out, apparently from power, everybody who doesn't fully agree with him. And then we'll take a look at Ukraine, where the Russians are once again warning about possible escalation. And of course, people in Europe and in Ukraine are starting to question whether the United States will remain committed to supporting Ukraine. Here this week to talk about all of these issues is Lijia Zhang, who's a writer and social commentator and public speaker. Her video is not working, but her microphone is, and so is her audio. So we will be hearing, though not seeing her. Lijia, it's wonderful to have you joining the program this week.
Thank you for having me.
And from New York City, Ravi Argawal, who is the editor-in-chief on foreign policy. Ravi, wonderful to have you back.
Great to be back, Ivo.
Also from London, Prashant Rao, who is the senior editor at Semafor, a new newsletter that is available in your inbox and whenever you want. And I'm joining you from Berlin, where I've spent the week in Europe. Prashant, great to see you. Ravi, great to see you. Lijia, sorry we can't see you, but I'm going to start with you. You are someone who spent your time in between Beijing and London. A lot of things are happening in China, and I just want to start with you and get your observation about how we should think about the consolidation of power by Xi Jinping that we saw on television and, of course, been reading about all week. What does this mean? How should we think about what Xi Jinping is doing?
Right. Well, first of all, I would like to say a few things about the Party Congress, the 20th Party Congress, which just happened in China. The Party Congress is the most important political event in China, normally held in October, November every year, every 5 years, when the leadership and other important political and economic decisions are made. So it usually attracts a lot of international attention. And this year attracted even more attention because something extraordinary has happened. Xi Jinping secured a third term that actually has violated the party succession convention established by Deng Xiaoping back in the 80s. And Deng Xiaoping was China's paramount leader who introduced the reform opening up. He saw how China made terrible mistakes like the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution under the leadership of Chairman Mao because of too much of a concentration of power. Now Xi just broken that convention. There was no surprise, by the way, people expected, but that's still because he had removed the term limit back in 2018. So now Xi had all the power he could have, and he just filled his top team with loyalists. So what does it mean to China and the world? Unfortunately, it is not good news for either China or for the world, because obviously too much concentration of power. There used to be some kind of a power sharing, which this mechanism is no longer in place. I would like to, if you want, I can expand a bit more.
No. That I think that's a perfect introduction, and I just want to get Ravi and Prashant. Ravi, your reaction to sort of the event of the consolidation of power and sort of what we now should be looking for from your perspective. And Prashant, come to you next, and then sort of start digging a little deeper into those consequences. But I just want to get your sense, Ravi, of what we saw in this Congress, what was expected, and frankly, what wasn't expected.
Yeah. So, before I tell you about my reaction, it's important to note that the markets didn't react very well on Monday, right after the end of the CCP Congress. The markets, the Chinese stocks in Hong Kong, for example, fell by the most since 2008. Yeah. So clearly, investors are worried about what some of the things they heard mean for, zero COVID, mean for big businesses in China, mean for, what foreign businesses can and cannot do in China. So there's certainly concerns around those kinds of things regarding the economy that Xi Jinping didn't do much to alleviate. In terms of my general reactions, there were some things that were not surprising at all. So, I mean, it was an open secret that Xi would get a third term. We all expected him to also pack the Politburo as well as the 7-member standing committee with people who were loyal to him. But I think, the degree to which he did so was perhaps a little bit surprising in that gone are any reform-minded voices, gone are any people who could potentially stand up to him, either in stature or in terms of other ideas, seems to have elevated people who adhere to the so-called wolf warrior mode of diplomacy. So it's much more likely that we will see a more sort of muscular Chinese foreign policy, or a Chinese foreign policy towards America, at least, that is, decidedly standoffish, just as America's is towards China, by the way. So all of those things, I guess, are much of a muchness. I think, one of the things that, many of us for some months now were wondering about was the zero COVID strategy, which, of course, is Xi Jinping's very tough measures to ensure that nobody really gets COVID, which means tough restrictions on how people can move, or if someone is detected with COVID, then everything is shut down. This is not a popular measure. Many people would have hoped, I imagine, there was one small protest in the lead up to the Congress that was highlighting that people aren't that happy with the zero COVID strategy. But it seems like Xi has more or less doubled down on it, partly because it may be hard for him to reverse course. That, of course, won't look good. Or maybe we will see some loosening over the next few months. But either way, that has impacts on the economy. That has impacts on the freedom of movement within China. It has impacts on how people can go in and out of the country, and so on and so forth. So those are a few of my initial reactions. But it's not like we're going to see any giant shifts in strategy. One person I spoke to, a former Obama administration official who worked on China policy at State, the phrase he used was, "We are now entering an era of maximum Xi." And I think that's a good way to look at it.
Era of maximum Xi, Prashant, that sort of sum it up from your perspective?
Yeah, I think both Lijia and Ravi sort of hit on this notion that, nothing in this Congress truly surprised us, in the sense of, we knew he would get the third term. I mean, to some degree, I think the Journal had a good piece that had some reasonable pushback. The new premier is a more complicated figure than simply a Xi loyalist. He was actually a reformist type in his previous jobs. But, I think the broad strokes, we broadly knew all of this stuff. I think like with the sort of anniversaries and moments that we know are coming and we can anticipate, what it provides is an opportunity to focus the mind and focus the conversation on a longer term trend of what has changed. And I think what has really changed is there's an excellent piece in the Journal Democracy recently that made the point that the era of economy is over now in China. And now we have entered the era of security. All of zero COVID, increased surveillance. We see an era of control of not, Lijia talked about opening up from the Deng Xiaoping era. And I think that, that seems clear now, that's gone. And I thought that summed it up really well. This idea that the way we thought of China in a prior generation was, the WTO accession and liberalization and reform and, coming into contact with the world in the post 79 and the post 89 periods. Now, it's quite the opposite, whether that's because of zero COVID or largely as a result of it. This is now, I think, the direction of travel. And that's what I think I took away from this the most, because the actual events, I think all of us on this call and all the listeners and viewers of this program will have anticipated anyway.
Yeah, Lijia, please.
Can I just talk a little bit about what kind of person Xi Jinping is.
Yes, please, and sort of and sort of how that tells us what we can expect from this. Absolutely.
So his father, the Xi Jinping, was a top revolutionary veteran, one of the so-called 8 immortals. Immortals, they live so long, so powerful. Anyway, so Xi Jinping himself was sent to the exile in poor rural China when his father was purged during the Cultural Revolution. So later he climbed up ranks and was nominated as the leader in China in the end of 2012. I remember so vividly, at that time I was living in Beijing as a writer and journalist. I vividly recall the sense of hope his ascension has inspired. I thought, he lived with ordinary people, probably have a better understanding of needs of ordinary people. And his dimpled smile, his down-to-earth style, lent him an image of a benevolent leader, which was a refreshing change from the reserved, conserved predecessors like Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao. And many commentators from in and outside China suggested that he might introduce radical reforms, he might be a liberal reformer, and himself fanned such expectation by talking about deepening reform and things. But actually, as soon as he took power, he started to amass power. For example, he introduced many small leading groups and named himself the leader of such leading groups, notably the leading groups, central groups for deepening reform, and himself as the boss, and he actually replaced that body and himself replaced some of the power previously held by premier and other state council members. And I think he's certainly patriotic, and somebody has a deep sense of history. He wants to go down history as somebody as grand as Chairman Mao. Chairman Mao was somebody who united China, who made Chinese people stand up, and Deng Xiaoping made China rich. He wanted to be seen as somebody who leads China into the central stage in the world, and he wants to see the unification with Taiwan.
Go ahead, please.
He thinks himself is the best person to lead China. He has such a deep conviction. China is facing lots of problems. He recognized in his speech, and he thinks China now needs a strong leader like himself.
Well, and he has, as a result, he has surrounded himself with people who will not challenge him in power, and he has the standing committee of the Politburo, the 7 most powerful members are, even physically look like Xi Jinping in some ways.
They all have dark suits, a white shirt, and dyed black hair. Nicely combed back. Yeah.
Well, and crucially, if I may add, they're also of an age where they couldn't really succeed him in a real way at the next party congress. So they're chosen not only for their loyalty, but for their age and their inability to ever challenge him in a real way. But if I may, Ivo, I just want to add as well, Lijia sort of made this parallel with Mao about how she wants to be seen as big as he was, or to have a legacy as grand as his was, or important as his was. That works both ways. This was already Xi's China. Now, absolutely it is. And for good and for bad. So, whether China's economy does well, or if there are grand mistakes, we remember Mao made several grand mistakes, those will all now truly be traced back to him in a way that could come back to hurt him in the future. I mean, even over the last few years, he has had the ability to point to other villains, whether those villains are corrupt party officials, corrupt local officials, rich capitalists, rich tech CEOs, he's been able to point to things, to images, to symbols, and to say, this is the problem. I am going to fix it. I will get rid of these problems. The thing is that system, that trend can't last forever, because at some point you've been around for long enough, you've amassed enough power, you've eliminated all obstacles and rivals, and then everyone is going to blame you if anything goes wrong. And I think at the very sort of deepest end of this is the meaning of the Chinese contract. I mean, if there is a social contract in China over the last couple of decades, it seems to be that, you get this rapid growth, which, as we know, since the 80s through the early 2010s was, close to 8, 9, 10% growth, the likes of which we haven't seen in the history of the world. And in lieu of that, you give up some freedoms. In lieu of that, you have, not a real democracy, but a party that gets to make all these big decisions. That social contract may not be as strong today as it was 10 years ago or 20 years ago. If China now is growing, I think in the last quarter it grew slower than America's economy did. That weakens the contract when you have something like zero COVID, which puts onerous restrictions on the Chinese people. And as I said earlier, it's one thing at the start of the pandemic where you can look around and say, you know what, we're all in this boat together. It's a global problem. That's changed now. I think Chinese people are beginning to see that, I'm in New York, Prashant's in London, you're in Berlin. All of us are able to move around freely. That cannot be lost on most Chinese people. Most Chinese people are, 1 to 2 to 3 degrees removed from relatives who live in the West, who are probably phoning home and saying, we can move around easily. All of that frays some of the social contract. And I bring this all up just to say that, while the takeaway from the last week is this notion of maximum Xi, it may come back to bite him later.
Yeah. Sorry, can I just budge in? Because Ravi, sorry, I don't know if I'm pronouncing your name correctly.
You are.
But you are just following what you said about social contracts. Funny enough, I'm just writing a piece for the South China Morning Post, which should come up in a couple of days' time, about the social contract. So exactly as you pointed out, that basically the Chinese government provide a stable environment for people to get on with their life and to gain economic gains. And ordinary people do not demand, political rights and such. But now the COVID zero policy has really taken a toll on economy or ordinary people's life. Ravi, you mentioned about the bridgeman who put up this on Sitong Bridge. He put up a banner attacking the zero COVID policy and Xi himself. And that was just the extraordinary act of courage. But I think that shows such a rare protest, but shows the depths of discontentment around people. In fact, there's video footage coming out showing that there was a protest in Lhasa, in Tibet, capital of Tibet, and also in Xinjiang and in Zhengzhou, in central China. People have been protesting. Sorry, another thing, sorry, just forgive me. I just want to make the point about Xi Jinping. If anything he learned from China's chaotic past, that for him was chaos should be avoided at any cost. And he did not want China, he does not want China to follow the fate of Soviet Union. So the way he does it is to tighten up social control and crack down on any dissenting voice, and human rights lawyers and activists are locked up. Even feminists now have been repressed. Sorry, over to you.
No, I think both Ravi and you, Lijia, have just painted a picture of a China that is very different than the one that we all were hoping to see when Xi Jinping came to power 10 years ago. And Prashant, I guess it raises sort of a profound question. What do we do about it, and how do you deal with a China like this? As I mentioned, I'm in Berlin. I spent part of the week in Brussels as well. And really pressing on this issue. To what extent is the the change that we have seen in Europe post Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which is pretty fundamental in saying we really can't do business with these people. We can't rely on them. We can't be vulnerable. We now understand the reality of all of this. And so how does that affect China? And I must say that particularly here in Germany, the question is still very much open. Part of a port in Hamburg has just been sold to the Chinese. Olaf Scholz, the chancellor, is next week will be in Beijing. By the way, he will literally fly overnight to get there, be there for the day, and then fly back because he can't stay there overnight because of COVID rules. Which are pretty just to underscore that, it's going to be pretty interesting to see whether they're meeting in hazmat suits or whatever, or how big the table is that Xi Jinping will have compared to, remember. But he's not just going there to have a conversation, which is understandable, and we need to have engagement. He's bringing a big business delegation with him as part of that. And when you ask people, so I get why he needs to talk with him, but why are you bringing the business delegation? So, well, we're in favor of diversification, but business is important. 40% of Volkswagen get its profits from this place. So, I mean, Prashant, when you think about the discussion in the United States, of course, which may be the driving force, but in London and other places, how are we all really understanding the change that means for a country which remains deeply entrenched in the global economy, and it's not just a gas station as Russia was, it's deeply entrenched, and how do we think about that? Big question, but sort of.
Wow. I didn't realize I'd be asked to write a PhD dissertation at this point in the conversation. I think, you've hit on all of the difficulties of this conversation, right? I mean, Olaf Scholz, for example, seems to continue to believe in a measure of commercial engagement that I think is very much not in fashion in London and Washington. And I think more and more across Europe, and particularly Central and Eastern Europe, who are deeply, places like Lithuania, who are more deeply skeptical of Beijing. And so, I guess how we answer this to some degree reflects our own kind of prioritization. China will not be like Russia or the Soviet Union. In fact, I mean, it's, as you say, too deeply enmeshed. These, the protests in Zhengzhou that Lijia is talking about, we were at a Foxconn factory, which is supplying iPhones. And so these things affect us in really remarkable ways and very direct ways. I think answering that question is enormously complicated. I don't think actually any policymaker, whether in London or DC or Berlin, has fully grasped what this looks like, just because it is too enormous. I don't think this is something you can have a policy about. The Biden administration is trying extremely hard to restrict semiconductor access, and according to a couple of reports, also looking at quantum computing and artificial intelligence. But what happens then when, as you say, major American customers and major American companies are suddenly shut out of a market of 1.4 billion people, which seems inevitable now to some degree? What happens when, the guy who just took control of maybe the most important political messaging, social messaging app in the Western world, Twitter, also has a gigafactory in Shanghai in one of his other companies? I say all these things to say I don't have an answer. I don't think anyone really does. And, it's very easy, I think, for officials, for certainly the German foreign minister and, the Green Party in Germany to disagree with Olaf Scholz. I don't think actually the Green Party's answer is as simple either. And not to say that I think Olaf Scholz is right to be taking the line he is, but I do actually think this is a far, far more complicated question than Russia is. By orders of magnitude.
I think that's very fair. It's the moment you start, it's an onion, right? You peel a little bit, you think there's a bad side outside, and then it turns out there's a pretty important part, and to keep on peeling and peeling. I think it's fair to say it's very complicated. Ravi, is it possible? Which I think is what the Biden administration is doing, is trying to say, can we carve some pieces out that may be a little different? Huawei and communication technology under the Trump administration, now chips and semiconductors, and maybe we can do a little bit here, but not on those areas. does the economy actually work that way, that you can take whole sectors and say that's no longer possible to have an integrated one, but the financial sector and the car sector and other sectors are going to be fine? What's your sense?
It's tough. I mean, it seems like the Biden administration is trying to compete, it's trying to contain, and it's trying to cooperate all at the same time. It wants to contain China's ambitions. It wants to contain it from becoming, for example, a tech powerhouse. I mean, Prashant and you've both mentioned some of the restrictions on Huawei, but also now, most recently, many other Chinese companies, which I think is a vastly underreported story in the Western media. I think the ripple effects are going to be immense, not only for Western companies, but global ones when you think of second order, third order changes down supply chains and subcontractors and the likes. So big global issue right there. But remember, the Biden administration also needs China. It needs it to be able to cooperate on climate change mitigation, on trade, for example, on many other issues of global significance and importance. But, mixed in with all of this is another broader issue that I think gets underplayed in discussions like these and in the West more broadly. I mean, you mentioned peeling the onion. I think we're also only looking at half the onion, because there are many countries around the world, in the global south especially, that I think are increasingly quite uncomfortable with US-China decoupling. They're quite uncomfortable with talk of a potential new Cold War between America and China, because several things have changed between now and the 1980s. When there was a Cold War with, the US and the Soviet, as you said, China is much more than just, a gas station. But more than that is the fact that the world has changed. I think, if you look at any, top 75 economy around the world, in the global south especially, they will count both the US and the China among their top trading partners. It's very hard for them to imagine a world in which suddenly they're asked to pick sides. So if you speak to the Thais or the Indonesians or even the Indians, they're going to say, this new world in which we're being forced to choose, in which the world's two biggest economies essentially are loggerheads, is not a great world for us. And that's another thing I think increasingly for the Biden administration to have to grapple with. We're seeing already, just to tie this into Russia-Ukraine, if you look at one of the reasons why so many countries around the world haven't signed on to sanctions against Russia is because they're uncomfortable with an us or them kind of world. Hence all the talk of a new non-alignment.
Yeah, no, I think that's a fair point. Lijia, I'm going to back to you for final comment on sort of the Beijing side of and actually the China, not just Beijing, the China side of this story, because part of the message that we're getting from Xi Jinping and the response that you're getting from the West is this desire to kind of isolate from each other, create a bigger distance between each other. And so what is the mood in China writ large on that part of the change? Is there, no more travel, which was part of the opening up? How does the man and woman on the street in China react to this increasing control, the increasing securitization, as Prashant argued, the closing down of the economic interaction and the people interaction because of COVID? How's the mood, and how long will that mood be able to accept the new reality?
Yeah. In this piece I'm writing for the Saturday Morning Post about a social contract. Oh, sorry. So there was a professor from York University in Canada did a follow-up survey, which shows that 95% of people, and this guy called Dr. Gary Wu from York University, he did a survey in when Wuhan just opened up in April 2020, and found that Chinese people's trust in the government has increased. And then he did a follow-up survey of the past 2 months, and which showed 95% of Chinese people support, have faith in central government. And I think overall, I think many people in small towns and villages, they definitely have strong faith in their government, partly because there's little space for to voice their dissent, and partly because the rising nationalism. So I think I think that the government had to be, I think because of the COVID, the policy, many people are unhappy about the situation. Earlier you asked the question about the foreign policy, and I think under Xi, the third term, I think we're likely to continue to see a kind of a more aggressive policy, foreign policies, kind of a wolf warrior spirit. And I should go back and mention a little bit under Deng Xiaoping urged the people to 韬光养晦, which meant stay a low profile, biding your time. But Xi Jinping obviously believed that China was powerful enough, strong enough to stand up to the West. So he, introduced this more aggressive tone and using quite aggressive language. Anybody who dare to be obstruct China will get their head cracked open, things like that. I think that's really worrying, and our neighbors are concerned. And some of the neighbors, they do business with both China and US, as Ravi pointed out. And sometimes it's really awkward. They felt they have been forced to take sides.
Yeah, that's a word that one hears a lot. And I remember the Singaporean prime minister once told the United States, "Don't ask us to choose because you may not like the site we're choosing." So if we're going to ask, we better know which one, how we want to come that out. It's a fascinating story, and we haven't even talked about the image of Hu Jintao being manhandled out of the room, and clearly not how you deal with somebody who would have COVID. So that's probably not the reason it happened. But a story that we will have to continue to follow, and I think really thank all of you for your insights. Even if we don't necessarily have all the answers, but then that's kind of hard in the situation that we're facing. Speaking of another set of issues where it may not be so easy to get all the answers, the situation in Ukraine is now entered its ninth month. The war that was going to last 3 days is now in its ninth month. It almost sounds like a tragedy if it wasn't such an extraordinary set of developments. Sort of two-part of the issue I wanted to talk about. And first, Ravi, maybe start with you. Very strange kind of behavior by the Russians over the past few days, with the defense minister getting on the horn with his British, French, American, and Turkish counterparts, warning about an imminent threat of a dirty bomb by the Ukrainians, and then Putin twice, I believe, in the last couple of days, coming out publicly about that as well. How should we read what they're trying to do? Is it as silly as trying to plant a false flag, which doesn't sound like it's likely, but how should we think about it, and how concerned should we be?
We should be concerned. I mean, I read into this signs of desperation. So this began over the weekend, last weekend, with Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu, as you say, calling his counterparts in France and the UK. He hadn't spoken with Defense Secretary Austin in the US much, I think just twice since the war began. So significant that he would call him to essentially say that they think Ukraine will, launch a dirty bomb somewhere, which of course is, a device that contains radioactive material and then is dispersed through a traditional bomb, hence dirty. But it's not something that the Ukrainians would really gain much from using, because it wouldn't change the course of the war. Usually these kinds of bombs could impact, the amount of area covered by, a dozen blocks or so. Several days, given that these are sort of radioactive kind of reactions over time. So begs the question why Ukraine would need to do something like that, which has never been done before, by the way. I mean, this is just a sort of a theorized device, but a very difficult device to put together, and a one with strange sort of payoffs. The theory is, and this is what U.S. President Joe Biden alluded to, and Secretary Blinken as well, in things they said later, which is that this is probably a false flag attack, of a false flag indicator of sorts, where Russia is looking for pretexts. So instead of pre-blaming or pre-baking this idea that Ukraine would use a dirty bomb, then Russia then has an opening in which to use a tactical nuclear device or escalate in some other form. We don't know, of course. Who knows what the reality is here? I mean, it's important to point out there's no evidence to prove anything either way on any of these discussions, any of these things we're hearing from any of these leaders or interlocutors. But what we do know are the facts on the ground. And the facts on the ground are that Russia has lost more territory than it's gained in the territories it had sort of falsely annexed, and remains on the upswing. And Putin has taken increasingly desperate measures over the last couple of months that had seemed unthinkable before. I mean, again, calling up 300,000 reservists is a move that will have ripple effects and will affect his popularity. They seem desperate. That's my takeaway from it. And I think we're entering a worrying phase. A desperate Putin is not a good Putin.
Yeah, desperate Putin certainly isn't a good Putin, Prashant. And if you start thinking about, leaders who have difficulties at home, we just talked about Xi Jinping having difficulties at home and becoming more aggressive, perhaps as a result of it. Here's a guy who really is in the corner and keeps on finding new corners to put himself in, I guess the big question is there at some point a need to help him find out a way out of that corner? Is there Biden, when he warned about Armageddon and also talked about the need for an off-ramp, a terrible phrase, but diplomats use it all the time. But the sort of a sense that how do we help this guy not do the terrible things he is capable of? Are we getting to that point in the discussion?
I think to some extent, I mean, Ivo, your experience at NATO, I mean, you have much more experience in this than me. It feels like we've been at this point now for 9 months of just worrying that this is now a capability that Vladimir Putin has. And, I don't think any of us believe that if he sort of ordered some kind of horrific strike, that the Russian military wouldn't do it. It's unclear what their command and control system is and how they would, carry out any of Putin's orders, and if there would be any kind of restraint exercised. So, there is obviously and has been understandable talk of an off-ramp, but also I think, one of the interesting things is in DC now, to some extent, I mean, you and Ravi would know this better, but it really seems like discussion of an off-ramp is verboten now. This letter from the 30 Democrats, McCarthy from a different point of view, sort of any sort of sign of either compromise or capitulation in Washington is now, outside of the mainstream, and so far outside of the mainstream that people have to retract it. They have to walk it back. And so even if we do talk about an off-ramp, I also don't see how it becomes politically feasible in places, I mean, really DC, to a lesser extent London, and perhaps differently on the continent, but I just feel like there's not an opportunity in Washington either for this.
So Lijia, one of the interesting things that I hear from here in Berlin from people who are justifying Olaf Scholz's trip to China this coming week is exactly this point. If there's one person who can help Vladimir Putin step off the ledge, it might be Xi Jinping.
Yes.
What's your sense?
Yes, and yes, that I think so. But that leads to the point I want to make is that, I just read an article in the New York Times saying the Pentagon outlined strategy against Russia and China. And I really don't think that the US should lump China and Russia like this. I think they are very different. And I think overly hostile attitude towards China will push China closer to Russia. And I think China can potentially play a uniquely placed. I think China can potentially play an important role in ease the tension or even persuade Russia not to use nuclear. And I think the US should recognize this. Instead, the US has turned more hostile to China. The stick and carrots approach. I think the US has not thrown enough carrots at China, but swings its big stick too readily. That's not good. And the war is going on. People are dying. Compared to this, and China surely is the less evil.
Yeah, no, I think that's right, and I think I hope that the president talks with Scholz and that there's sort of a common strategy where encouraging Xi Jinping to, he's never going to adopt sanctions or even vote with us in the UN, but that's not as important as helping him encourage Putin to not do worse than he has already done, and it can get a lot worse as we know. Just in the last few minutes, Prashant, that we have, the other thing I'm hearing in Europe, and you being in London, I think you're hearing more too, increasing concern because of the McCarthy statement you mentioned, and of course the letter, that the willingness of the United States to stay the course on Ukraine, it may be called into question, and a recognition that if the U.S. is not there anymore in terms of supporting the Ukraine, then the ability and willingness of other countries, including the Germans in particular, but the French and perhaps even the Brits, to sort of stay the course, even if they could, that they're willing to do so, falls apart. So really, a sense that we're getting to a moment of crisis. One sort of, how does it look that from London? London has been a little busy with a couple of other things in the last few days.
Leadership change.
But also, how real should that concern be? Is that really what's going to happen?
I think when you start thinking too deeply about all these things, your head starts to hurt, because all of these are interlocked one way or another in sort of remarkable ways. You talked about Xi and his incentives to deal with Putin. I've talked to a bunch of people who think, analyze China well and, are really thoughtful on it. And they say, if Xi Jinping was to be helpful on Putin, would the US suddenly lift its semiconductor restrictions? Probably not. And so what is the incentive? What would Beijing get? Not to say that that's the only reason it would do something, but to some degree, there has to be some give and take, and it does seem like there's an appetite in DC for this. Now, looking at, how the politics of Ukraine play out, I think as we get through this winter, and Europe in particular goes through what will certainly be a very difficult winter from a perspective of a cost of living, from inflation, interest rate rises, Britain in particular, but also to a lesser extent, several other European countries are going to see increased mortgage costs, increased energy costs, which will be extremely hard to bear. It would not be surprising to see support for Ukraine fray. I think the other thing is, Britain in particular has a huge public finance problem, and Rishi Sunak has said that he is not necessarily committed to spending 3% on NATO, which Liz Truss had said that she was committed to. These are all markers which over time, suggest that there is some level of unity that is starting to break apart a little bit in sort of ways. Now, these 30 Democrats might have withdrawn the statement, but they were considering it in July then, and that says something that when it looked like Ukraine was losing, they were willing to advocate this kind of compromise. And now that Ukraine is winning, they've withdrawn it. But the fact is that conversation was happening. And so the unity that the United States presents is not really as united as we'd like to think.
Yeah, and by the way, that conversation in July was taking place when gas prices were hitting the roof. And I think the larger point that maybe we all take away at the end of this is the economic cost and pain that people are starting to feel in as inflation rises, as a recession moves in, as it will inevitably in London and in the UK, as it looks like increasingly in Germany and other places because of rising energy and other costs. The willingness to bear the burdens of helping a faraway land of whom we know nothing, to coin an old phrase.
I think it's important to say here that, regular people who are, considering whether they want to do this, it's not unreasonable for them to think this, that when your next door neighbor is struggling to heat their home because the cost of living are increasing so much, it's not unreasonable to ask, is this worth it? That in my neighborhood, it is hard to get through the winter. And what if we just did some kind of compromise? And you can kind of understand why people do this. And it's very easy for, many of us who make enough to not be able to get through, but it's not true for a lot of people, particularly in the UK and large parts of Europe.
I think that's exactly where we're going to have to see how it actually evolves and whether we can sustain this. And we'll get the answer one of these weeks at World Review. But in the meantime, I really want to thank Lijia Zhang, Prashant Rao, Ravi Argawal for really insightful conversation today. Hope you all enjoyed it as you have tuned in, and that you'll tune in again next week for another edition of World Review. And until then, bon weekend.